Welcome to the Comfortable in Chaos Podcast. Strangle your demons and let's go.
Y'all need Jesus!
Good to be back, man. Good to be back. Where do we go here? I love Jackson Brown. Kind of got that feel. I love the Eagles. Of course, we knew they were all buds. I tell you what, let's break it down like this. You ready? A one, a two, a 1, 2, 3. Look at us, baby, up all night, tearing our love apart. Aren't we the same two people who lived through years in the dark? Whoa, every time I try to walk away, something makes me turn around and stay. And I can't tell you why. No, baby, I can't tell you why. Welcome to the Comfortable in Chaos Podcast. I am your host, Eric Hellberg, and you know we're like Einstein over here, man. We have no special talents. We're just passionately curious about all things pertaining to men. And for my listeners, where do I go from here? And how in the hell do we keep going from here? All right, guys, obviously I chose the Eagles. That's a classic. I can't tell you why. No, baby, I can't tell you why. All right, man, I'm back. Guys, I had a little, what would you call that? Intermission. My son had a chance to play in this cool baseball all-state game. I wanted to make messages, but dudes, it was 100 degrees every day, and out on the turf on the fields, it was 115. It was brutal. Friday was hotter than the hinges on the gates of hell. Saturday as well. Felt like we got a little respite today, but really I just think that was pure acclimation, and we were working hard to get ready and be competitive in the heat, and it worked out. Thank God. When we left our last episode, we had finished up on the Olympics. I'm kind of like thinking, do we talk about Macron's transvestite wife? Do we go into pedophilia at the Olympics? I will do that this week. I think for now, let's just shore up our bases and let's touch upon a few pending items. And I have to give a generous applause because we have grown our burgeoning flock with some new Japanese listeners and some Korean listeners. Now look, I haven't made it to Japan yet, but I'm totally Bushido, man. I dig it. And I know quality of life over there is pretty damn good. I am going to get the kids that way. Now, I did train some dudes that would come from Okinawa to the Korean Peninsula when I was stationed there at 2nd ID up at Camp Casey. And I remember that place pretty fondly. I would like to go back. I know places like Red Cloud and all those ones right close to us at the DMZ no longer exist. But Casey still exists, a kind of a former shell of itself. But man, I remember those days. I remember my call for fire station where I used to teach dudes up on a mountain. I remember Corporal Kim, my Catoosa, actually my platoon's Catoosa, although he thought my squad was the coolest and he hung with us a bunch. Dude had 2 black belts, drank copious amounts of soju, and before a piss test one morning, that dude had me riled up on that shit, man. They had mixed it with Gatorade. I couldn't even feel my teeth. And I think my section sergeant came in there. He's like, hey, Hellberg, just go to sleep, dude, man. You're good. But that was a running sumbitch, man, Corporal Kim. But man, a lot of times he would get right in front of me during PT. And that dude would eat so much kimchi, man, when he would start sweating during those runs. Man, it just wasn't the smell I was digging. But as a man, dude was far out. And I knew he came from a pretty exclusive well-known family, actually political family in South Korea. And damn it, he got stuck with us. But we had some good times. And at least he didn't have to be like those other rock soldiers. When we'd be on patrol, come upon, I'd say, damn, just an icy stream. Those dudes would be being hazed butt naked in those streams. It was something else. But I think I'd like to go back there. I think I would have a better appreciation for that culture. I was a bit myopic back then, but wisdom comes with age oftentimes. 2 countries I need to go spend some considerable time in. I thank you all for your listenership. Now let's get it on, boys. So let's go to Amani Khalif. Remember, we talked about the putrid things that are really going on in Paris and the Olympic Games, and of course they're winding down. Novak Djokovic, my dude, just won a gold medal finally for Serbia. Badass. There's nothing else in his, I guess you could say, portfolio that he is any longer in need of. But good old Amani, we know that she had the fight with the Italiano, and of course she got on her knees after being belted a couple of times and said, man, it's unjust, it's unfair. And after those opening ceremonies, did you know Christians came out en masse the very next day? They sure did. They wanted to extol who Christ is, what Christ represents, and who he is to them, and actually mankind. And isn't the Olympics about mankind? And interestingly enough, there was a total blackout in Paris the very next night after those opening ceremonies. I would almost hearken that to a spiritual sign that the Lord will not be mocked. No, sir. He will not be mocked. Now, after that, an Olympic spokesperson, a lady, of course, they want to put a lady's face on there to give them a little bit more genteel messaging. And she said that their message was all about inclusion, although they were sorry if it offended some people because they mainly attempt to espouse tolerance. And then when they were talking about allowing Alani, Kamani, whatever the hell you want to call her, Rafsanjani, whatever the hell, Algerian, an Arab, either an Arab or a Berber, right? When you go to Algeria, we know it's approximately 80-something% Arab. We know around 15, 17% Berber. The remaining faction is just a small litany of people who had descended from some European countries like Italy and France and Spain. So how that whole transgender thing was pulled off, if that boxer is actually Arab, I don't know. There must be more to the story. But when saying that he was going to be allowed to compete, they said they didn't want to have a message of exclusivity. In fact, in the world of boxing, they wanted inclusion. So here is for you, my Algerian boxing friend. I just got wind that Iron Mike, no, better yet, Big Mike, and I'm not talking about Michelle Obama, although that would be a good, formidable task for you. Let's just say that Big Mike, meaning Iron Mike Tyson, now has started to identify as a woman. Are you ready, Kalani, to take on Tyson? That's kind of like the skill and strength differential by which you've been demonstrating your prowess. So let's get apples to apples. Are you ready to fight? Well, I believe us men are ready to fight. And now that we are in 63 countries, thank you to my newfound Japanese and Korean brethren. And let's add, a couple of harem of women out there. We're ready to not forget where we came from. I think that is super important. And speaking of where people come from, I was struck when getting ready for this message. I found an old clip on the Communist News Network, CNN, and of course, right before good old President Biden said that Kamala was going to be his VP pick, you know, she was still in the race, but back then She was exalting her Indian heritage and how much her mother taught her. My goodness. They did a whole 6-minute segment on it. It was profound, and it could bring a tear to a liberal's eye. It really could. But now CNN's calling her, she's black. They forgot about the Indian. They forgot about the Jamaican. Kamala's just plain old black. Isn't that something? But what I think the media has also missed is, let's go back to Barack Hussein Obama Jr., because who was Barack Hussein Obama Sr., the dad that left him at 2 years old? He was a Kenyan senior governmental economist. And his whole predisposition was wrapped around kind of like the concentration of wealth and income inequality. And I will venture to tell you, here in the West, and especially in America, that certainly does exist. However, he was coming at it from a very different way. But do you know who also denoted that as a pressing concern in his background? You have Barack's father, but good old Donald Harris. My goodness. Donald Harris, the father of Kamala. Kamala's dad was a Stanford economist who believed in Keynesian economics, Marxist critiques of capitalism, and a little subset, what we would call Fabian socialism. Now, we don't need to get off into the weeds in that, but I think it's a bit remarkable that these two like individuals and or like candidates, total frauds, that actually stand for nothing, actually came from nothing, have similar patriarchal pedigrees. So maybe Barack Hussein Obama Sr. was correct, because before Barry hit the international, or I should say at least our national stage here, of course they did give him a Nobel Prize for nothing, maybe for extraneous killing, the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo. But maybe Senior was correct, because before he was thrust into that limelight, Barry was barely a singular millionaire. But then he loaded up the truck and he moved to Beverly. Now he's worth hundreds of millions of dollars on a $400K salary. Now, that's almost an impossibility, but he's there. So maybe there is something to those economic ideologies. And just remember, the president that y'all hate so much that they just attempted to kill, they are desperately trying to keep from getting in office again, he's the man who has always foregone his salary. He's also the man who never made one penny off the backs of the American people. And it just goes to what we're learning on the CIC and what you guys, you're paying attention. You notice it's wrong. You can see it's wrong. You hear it's wrong. And really, liberalism is this. You've heard me quote Dr. Michael Savage and say liberalism is a mental disorder, and it is. But it is also a religion of self-hatred. That's what it is. A religion of self-hatred. It teaches white people to hate their race, boys to hate their sex, women to hate their femininity, Americans to hate their country, Westerners to hate their history. And it is a loathsome, poisonous thing. We're not taking that toxin anymore. Therefore, let's, instead of a toxic brew, let's imbibe on an elixir of enlightenment. Let's search for truth. And how about, would you believe someone like Major General Smedley Darlington Butler, better known as the Warring Quaker, the Maverick Marine? He was badass. Everyone remembered not too long ago General Mad Dog Mattis of the Marine Corps. He said, we're going to kill those bastards. All right. Well, Smedley Butler was definitely his precursor. But I'll tell you where all Smedley Butler campaigned. And this is not in order. He was in the Philippine-American War. He was in the Banana Wars. He was in the Boxer Rebellion, think China, the Mexican Revolution, and ultimately World War I. 34-year storied career, and at the time of his death, he was the most decorated Marine in the Corps' history and probably the most decorated serviceman in existence at that time. Do you realize that Smedley Butler won 2 Congressional Medals of Honor, all in separate actions? At that time, he also had received the Marine Corps Brevet Medal, which the Corps considered an equivalent to the Congressional Medal of Honor way back then. He was an amazing man, an amazing warrior, an amazing leader, and all of his men would proudly give their life for their country and for him. He inspired that much courage, that much awe, and he was right there in the thick of it with his guys. Okay, so I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story about Smedley Butler. After he retired from his storied career, did you know he became a popular advocate, speaking at meetings organized by veterans? I mean, that makes perfect sense. But veterans who had now taken on a more pacifistic mindset. And then he primarily spoke to grassroots church groups throughout our nation. He wanted the pastors involved, because he believed in a formal faith. And he believed on the ability of the church to persuade the masses, provided they were doing their job. And you've already heard my inclinations that they no longer do it. And I gave you the rationales why. But that's what he spent the 1930s doing. And then Smedley started openly denouncing capitalism and bankers. Now keep in mind, General Butler was a self-described Republican. His maternal grandfather, also a Quaker, was a Republican congressman. They hailed from Pennsylvania. Ultimately, what this led to, and this is what he called it, General Smedley Butler said he ended up being no better than a high-class muscle man for Wall Street, the bankers, and big business. And he ended up labeling his own self and his military career as a racketeer for capitalism. And this culminated in 1935 with him writing a book, and you can still find it. What jogged my memory on General Butler was I have this book on Audible. As I was at the baseball tournament in between innings, I was scrolling and I found that. I'm like, why didn't I read this book? But yes, he wrote that book. War is a Racket in 1935, and he only lived to 58. He actually died in 1940. And that's why I said at that time, I don't know what Audie Murphy ended up with in World War II. But at the time of General Smedley Butler's death in 1940, he was the most decorated serviceman, period. I think I also forgot to tell you at that time it was called the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. All right. Would you believe a man like this? So maybe we ought be talking about what Mr. Harris and maybe Mr. Obama were alluding to, albeit their ideas were a bit misguided. But can you deny in any way, shape, or form that the American economy is always set on a wartime footing and that we profit from war, that we lift up our economy with never-ending wars, that racketeering is pervasive, and that whether it is done with guns and bullets, there is a war against the American people in many different aspects. Take healthcare. We don't have any care of our health here in America. We have disease management. And when you look at the fact that heart disease was not even really prevalent until the 80s, when it became rampant, well, that was because of the practices of the dietary and medical community in the 60s. And it took a couple of decades for it to catch on and have deleterious effects in common society. The end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s, that's the first time that you really started seeing Alzheimer's and autism start to run rampant. These are all relatively new diseases, diabetes as well. That crap that they are feeding us, going back to the word toxin, is designed to kill us. We have open warfare because of our lifestyle and what we are provided, via choice here in America today. So maybe Smedley Butler was actually onto something, and maybe those miscreants, Obama and Harris, were as well. But it is, where is it that we want to take it? How do we want to cleanse it? And what is it that we want about this free market economy so it actually encompasses all of us? So let's do a little run-up. Let's do a little accountabilities, a little bit of factoids leading up to General Butler and what we just described. All right, keep in mind, we had World War I. After World War I, we had a tremendous output of American dollars to send our boys to fight in Europe. Then what happens? Due to market manipulation, we follow up with what? The market crashes, the Great Depression. Those at the very top, the rich of the richest, while everyone else is decimated, starving. My God, they got richer? Okay. So in 1932, imagine this. Thousands of World War I vets converged on Washington, D.C., and they set up camps, and they demanded immediate payment of bonuses that were due to them. Why were they due to the World War I vets? They were due to them under what Congress had passed, known as the World War Adjusted Compensation Act. Compensation Act of 1924. But Congress was smart, kind of like Social Security. They said those bonuses were initially due no earlier than 1925 and all no later than 1945. But the average American man was starving, and he had families, and they were starving. So they wanted their bonuses that they were rightfully due. Well, guess what? General Smedley Butler said, that's enough. These men need their stuff. He showed up, and you know what he did? He spoke at the mall, the National Mall, on their behalf. Well, guess what happened? President Herbert Hoover, and we ain't talking from all in the family, just like Herbert Hoover again. Nope, you know what he did? He sent a burgeoning general, you know we love that word on the CIC, a man by the name of General Douglas MacArthur, right? A neocon. What would we call him? A self-aggrandizer. The man who would come back to the Philippines. I will return. And under Herbert Hoover's command and Douglas MacArthur's watch, Smedley Butler wasn't prepared to have a civil war in his America, our America at that time. Good old General Douglas MacArthur, he commanded cavalry troops back then. They came on in there, destroyed their own brothers' camps. They quelled the quasi-rebellion, albeit a peaceful rebellion. You can still see fires to this day if you can find some actual pictorial history left of that time. Flames everywhere. They set them all ablaze and kicked them out under threat of force. Brother to brother. We were that close at that time to another civil war. Okay, that was 1932, right? OMG, man. OMG. Who would have thought that back then, and fresh off the pains of war, that veterans would be fighting at that time for their own benefits, and that our own government would be openly hostile to them? Have we really changed it all? Or is that why on the Comfortable in Chaos podcast we say we need to know our history? Because it certainly is repeating itself. Not only do veterans get challenged for benefits, but we have an openly hostile police state style government that has already declared them to be the enemy. So obviously an honorable man like Smedley Butler is not going to abide by that. So what does he do? He throws his support to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who ends up winning the election. But you know what really kind of cast the business world their own aspersions toward FDR, although the people seemed to genuinely love him? They were very upset because he had made a campaign promise that the government was going to provide jobs for all the unemployed. Now, are we starting to get into those realms of what I described earlier from the two economists, Harris and Obama? Perhaps. Were we a starving nation coming off of one world war, then a Great Depression? Definitely. How did we ultimately pull ourselves out of that scenario? It wasn't via any New Deal that Roosevelt passed, economic policy, although that did help. Ultimately, what pulled us up by our bootstraps, colloquially, was another effing world war not too long thereafter. But the crazy thing about it is, what really got them going was we took the gold standard off, right? FDR removed us from the gold standard, so we didn't actually have to have a physical backing to our currency anymore. Now, we can decry that to this day because things have gone rampant, more than rampant. But what really happened was a select group of businessmen, J.P. Morgan being one of them, the heir to the Singer, think the old sewing machine companies back then. And he was prominent in this as well. But really what these guys were worried about at that time was that it would undermine both their private and their business fortunes. And they complained in private through their own channels, right? That it could possibly lead to national bankruptcy. But to Smedley Butler, it was becoming ever more clear. He had drank the elixir of enlightenment long before, but he had missed some things because he was so focused myopically at doing well for his country and leading the men under his various commands. So he took that with a grain of salt, and now FDR was in. But what he noticed was that FDR was kowtowing to big business. That big business seemed to control everything. And he then realized that J.P. Morgan was instrumental in the establishment of the Federal Reserve Act. And therefore, he and his constituents were playing Smedley Butler because of his renown. So what did Smedley do? He went around and he tried to get the VFW more invigorated, more pronounced, the veterans of foreign wars, to let them know that they had every bit as big a right to lobby Congress for their benefits that still were not forthcoming as any American corporation. And he totally discredited the American Legion, who he said had already been infiltrated and bought by big business. It was just simply a military conduit to our legislators. Well, lo and behold, what happens? The year is still 1933. And Butler is alarmed and aware of the American Legion. But he then gets approached by two officers within the federal offices of the American Legion, meaning the Washington, D.C. headquarters, the governing body of the American Legion. One of the gentlemen is Gerald C. McGuire, and the other is Bob Doyle. Bob Doyle, he's kind of incidental. Only Gerald C. McGuire's name is brought up in the closed-door testimony that Butler then goes on to give to Congress. It's noteworthy about McGuire, though, because he was a bond salesman for a Wall Street firm. So what happens? They show up and they offer, in today's dollars, approximately $3 to $3.5 million. It was $150K back then that they offered to General Butler to deliver a speech at an American Legion convention. A speech which had very little to do with Veterans Affairs. Instead, they wanted him to deliver a speech now critical of FDR and his recent move away from the gold standard. Now, you can take two sides of this coin. And you can say that the departure from the gold standard just added more concern to these captains of industry or these bankers because he had plans to provide subsidizations and jobs for the poor, many of which were veterans, and to help people get back to work who were still reeling from World War I and the Great Depression. Of course, what are they going to say? Roosevelt has socialist leanings, right? They're also going to say that, well, if we move off the gold standard, we have a bunch of globally backed loans backed by gold. And if we have moved away, perhaps that diminishes our chances to be paid back via the president's new policies. Okay, well, that's two sides of the coin right there. Well, ultimately what it comes down to is Butler, because he understands chain of command, he wanted to know who McGuire's supervisor was. And so another meeting is set up, and none other than Robert Sterling Clark shows up. Remember I mentioned this earlier, an heir to the Singer sewing fortune. And what does he tell Butler? What does Sterling Clark tell Butler? He says his real interest is in preserving the gold standard. He was worth $30 million at that time. And he says, I'm willing to give you half of that to save the other half in what is to come. Well, Butler, true to his patriotic form, he flatly refuses the offer to deliver the speech at the convention in Chicago. He parts ways with those guys. Well, then what happens is McGuire goes all through Europe. I know this sounds fanciful and crazy. And starts sending General Butler postcards from various European locations. Well, McGuire not only had juice from Wall Street, but also from military circles. And the rationale for his trip to Europe was he wanted to see how veterans and their organizations after the war operated throughout Europe. And he came back and he said he had discounted the governments of Germany and Italy, but that he thought the best way for our government to run and the way to ensure, what would we call, homogenization of our government, and to make sure that their agendas were carefully carried out, was to have a military government. But they needed someone of renown that had the belief of the troops. And he promised Smedley Butler an army of 500,000 veterans that had their support and the capitalist, the bankers' support. And they said all General Butler had to do was lead these men in a peaceful march on the White House to displace Roosevelt. And they said it would be relatively easy, one, because we know that physically he was infirm throughout his 3 administrations, right? But they considered him infirm as well because of his time of tenure, his short time in office. Therefore, now was the time to strike. But you know what Smedley's thinking? This damn thing stinks to high heaven. I've already had cavalry troops under Herbert Hoover and General Douglas MacArthur come, and yes, they gassed their own U.S. veterans. Several veterans were killed in that peaceful protest, and many were injured. You never, ever hear about it. And many of those veterans went on the mall and the accompanying areas to set up their encampments with their families in tow. So General Butler, what does he do? He goes to Congress. And they basically tell him he's full of you know what. But then they begin some closed-door hearings in secret. And they called this whole debacle the business coup or the business plot. Look it up. So here is a highly decorated Marine Corps general, beloved by his men. He is engaged in warfare and represented our country's interest all over the world. But he is shunned by our own congressional leaders. Well, one of his post-separation jobs for Smedley Butler, he was the director of public safety for the city of Philadelphia, and previous to that, a police captain. He was from Pennsylvania. His grandfather was a congressman from Pennsylvania, so he had enormous juice, both on the civilian side and within the military. And you got to realize about Smedley Butler, he was actually born into a life of privilege. He chose to go fight for this country. All over, he gave that up. He had a belief. He wanted to live a life of honor. He wanted to live a life of service. Something that he saw the higher he went just started turning the engines inside of him. So for veracity, he reaches out to the Philadelphia Record newspaper with Paul Cormley French, an investigative reporter. So French not only agrees to meet with Butler, of course, they bring McGuire as well, the bond salesman from Wall Street. And during this meeting, McGuire tells French, now keep in mind, he's the head of the American Legion too, that much like Germany, he believed a fascist state was the only answer for America. And that General Butler was the ideal leader because he could organize 1 million men overnight. So here is the most decorated man in the military, bringing to our elected officials evidence of traitorous activity, but they ignore him. It then did culminate into closed-door sessions in Congress. But it didn't go anywhere. Why? Because the actual actors involved were much too powerful. Congress focused on Mr. McGuire, who they could discredit. He was a bond salesman, an American Legion member. They actually redacted the principals' names because they said it was unproven. Now, I will tell you this, because of all that testimony and General Butler being a true patriot, that's what led him in 1935, after the sessions in 34, to write the book, War is a Racket. And did you know that in 1936, the New York Times, the New York Post, and the Philadelphia Record all wrote articles saying that General Smedley Butler was correct? It 100% did occur, and exactly as he demonstrated to them, to the word. But no one was held accountable for treasonous activities against our government, or for espousing that they should occur under this man's leadership. Now, who were these names? I already mentioned to you Mr. Clark, heir to the Singer fortune. I already mentioned to you J.P. Morgan. Do they get bigger than that? Did you know there was another one at play? A gentleman by the name of, I'm going to go ahead and say it, Prescott Bush. Bush family. You've heard all my episodes. Bushmaster. You've heard about Nazi collaboration, Nazi funding, Nazi ties. Let's delve into that just a little bit more here. Good old Prescott, who at that time was a general partner of Brown Brothers Harriman. They did not develop the offshoot yet of Union Bank there in New York City, which became the principal funneling instrument for the Third Reich, Hitler's war machine, and all their equipment and all the American currency went through Prescott's bank. Okay, so we know he was tied in. Did you know, in fact, in July of 2007, the BBC did an investigation on Prescott Bush? And that the gentleman that did the story, this man's name was Mr. Katz, Jonathan Katz. And he said that at that time, Prescott Bush was a key liaison between the 1933, remember it's called the business plot. So these were the business plotters, and the newly emerged Nazi regime in Germany. Remember, the Nazis had come on the scene in 32 or 33. This was this time frame. So they were already developing channels for their fascist agenda, not only in Europe, but also right here in the United States. Of course, the direct line funding occurred once they developed another ancillary bank called Union Bank that Prescott ran. But this reporter for the BBC, Jonathan Katz, said that Prescott was a key liaison between the 1933 business plotters and the newly emerged Nazi regime in Germany. Although, Katz went on to say, he was only supposed to open the doors because Prescott Bush was too involved with the actual Nazis to be involved with something that was so homegrown as the business plot. End of quotes. So in conclusion, we took a God-fearing man, an honorable man, a serving man, and we sent him to his death lamenting what he had done. And I am going to tell you a little bit of an expose when he wrote an article in conjunction with the War is a Racket book. Get the book, War is a Racket, published in 1935. This was in an article called, the magazine was called Common Sense. And here is where basically General Smedley Butler summarized some of his activity for big business, the military, and the government of the United States of America. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, and especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests in 1914. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the national city bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of a half a dozen Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. I helped purify Nicaragua for the international banking house of Brown Brothers Harriman. Thank you, Bush. In 1902 through 1912. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for the American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Honduras right for the American fruit companies in 1903. In China in 1927, I helped see to it that Standard Oil, thank you, Rockefeller, went on its way unmolested. Looking back on it, I might have given Al Capone a few hints. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts. I, General Smedley Butler, operated rackets on 3 continents. Maybe we do need to look into this capitalistic ideology as it stands today. Isn't history repeating itself? So until next time on the Comfortable in Chaos podcast, I bid you bon voyage, my burgeoning flock.